So thank you for that cold and dispassionate discussion.
Preach.
Yeah. So clearly in the course of this work, you ended up with a love affair with Lincoln, which doesn't distinguish you, but it strikes me that you also have that reaction to Grant. In my reading of your book, it's like your appreciation of the man, which is an interesting interpretation of Grant, grows. I wonder if you would share some of your key observations about that.
They were soulmates who had never met in ways. Brothers of another mother, as we say now, or different mothers. Grant was himself a self-made man, less good at making himself than Lincoln was. I'm touched by Grant's personal story. He never gave up. There's a very dramatic moment when he's left the army in humiliation, basically drummed out because he had been drinking too much on assignment in California. He missed his wife and his children so much. And he went to Illinois and tried farming. He was a complete failure and was reduced ultimately to trying to sell firewood out of the back of a wagon on a street corner in St. Louis, where he was discovered by one of his friends from the Mexican-American War, who was shocked. Sam, what are you doing? He said, I'm trying to feed my family. And that sort of plainness touches me, and also the terrible willingness to do what had to be done. If you believe, as I do, that it was the right thing to save the Union, Grant was the man who figured out how to do it. He learned the lesson at Shiloh. He says in his memoirs, up until that point, I felt that a few victories in the right places would break the rebellion. He was just like everybody else. He said, after I inflicted the cost that I did at Fort Donelson, and I won't go into that great victory, but pushed into the Deep South, had the Confederate Army on the run, took the surrender of an entire army at Donelson. After I did all that and they reformed themselves and hit me with that intensity at Shiloh, that's when I realized this war could not be won except by total conquest. And we all know what that terrible word ultimately meant. After Fredericksburg, the horrible battle in December that I talked about, Lincoln came sort of to the same conclusion. He looked at the 5,000 or so Union dead, at the 2,000 or so Confederate dead. He considered the relative populations of the two sections. He said, as awful as this loss was, if we could fight that same battle every day for a number of days, the South would be reduced to nothing, and we would still be a mighty host. And, that's an awful thing to say, but is what turned out. And when we can find the general who can face this arithmetic, we will win. That general was Grant. And so I think he deserves, with Lincoln, the credit for saving the Union. I also like the fact that he gave Lincoln no trouble at all. This last little point. In 1863, leading up to Gettysburg, spring of 1863, there's about that much in the collected works, page after page after page of telegrams between the president and Joe Hooker and other top generals in the Army of the Potomac. They're arguing over strategy and troops and when they can move and how they can move back and forth. Lincoln's begging and pleading. Not a word from Grant. And what was he doing in that period? Capturing Vicksburg. It's wonderful. After he's invested Vicksburg in this incredible campaign, there's a little short memo from one of his staff officers, a telegram, and it goes basically like, on April so-and-so, General Grant defeated the rebels at here. 2 days later, at there. 3 days later, captured Jackson. 4 days later, the Battle of... And it just... Bip, bip, bip. I like that.
Are you planning to write a book on Grant?
No.
All right,
No.
so there are lots of questions here about European powers and their capacity to intervene
Yes.
and the South's interest in their intervening. So
Yes.
can you outline for us why was it that the South failed to get Europe engaged in this process?
Right. This piece, which I didn't do justice to this morning, is so important. Lincoln and Seward both strongly believed, according to Nicolay and Hay, Lincoln's secretaries, these young men who spent more time with him than anybody, actually lived in the White House, woke up with him, went to bed at night when he did. They wrote a wonderful history, 10 volumes, of the Lincoln administration. And they say that Lincoln believed that the foreign policy piece was the most important piece of his entire early presidency. How did he keep them out? He begged. The begging process was sort of January 1862. In February, Grant gave him this great Donaldson campaign, which in 2 weeks basically pushed the Confederates all the way out of Kentucky, Missouri, most of Arkansas, most of Tennessee, all the way down into northern Mississippi and Alabama. It was the most effective, efficient campaign of the entire war. And now Lincoln had a victory to show the Europeans. See, I told you, give us a little time and we'll get results. Here's our results. Well, the results then fizzled out. After capturing New Orleans in late April 1862, there's a long stretch where Union fortunes completely reverse. And during this time, there's more and more discussion in Paris and in London of intervention. What prevented that? 2 things. First, the very fortunate fact that Europeans take very long summer vacations. The British cabinet was on the verge, they were ready to vote to intervene, and they put it on the schedule for their October meeting. This was in late July. And in those 2 months, the Battle of Antietam was fought. And I know Professor Jim McPherson has been at this podium explaining the importance of Antietam, and the effect it had on the Europeans is one of those things. But the second is this river of blood that was running. After Shiloh, after the 7 days, the Europeans, especially the British, who had some very contemporary experience of war, they had just fought in India and in the Crimean, they looked at what was going on in North America and they were appalled. Palmerston, the prime minister I talked about, walked into a meeting, threw his hat on the table. He said, "Gentlemen, compared to what's going on in America, the 30 Years' War was a joke." And Seward and Lincoln were very clever about this. They fed that. They said, if you try to get in here, you're going to get all the way in and you are going to pay. Seward used the phrase, a war of the world. I believe it, one of the first times that expression had ever been used. And so ultimately the British looked at this and said, those people are crazy, we're not going over there.
Let me combine 2 questions, so it's kind of 2 parts. One is why didn't Lincoln get rid of these uncooperative generals sooner than he did. Why did he suffer fools so gladly?
Yeah.
And then the follow-up to that is the observation about West Point being the producer of so many on both sides.
Yes.
And what is the effect of that? How did it affect West Point? How did West Point affect the war?
I'll take them in opposite order. The question of West Point was very lively topic of debate in Washington throughout the first couple of years of the war. In 1862, it would come up at cabinet meetings all the time. There was one school of thought that said that West Point generals were overcautious, that they liked to build fortifications. The curriculum at West Point was engineering. And so they were very good at building trenches and forts and setting up sieges and all this sort of thing. And people who felt that, give them the cold steel, boys, just go kill people, they came to hate this trait of the West Pointers. This is what military science looked like to them. And then on the other side, there were people who pointed out that at least they knew what they were doing. There's a moment after this horrible battle of Second Manassas when the cabinet is waiting for Lincoln to show up. They're sitting around grousing, as they so often were, and Gideon Welles, the Navy Secretary, launches into his customary spiel against West Point, and then Edwin Stanton comes in, the Secretary of War, and says, we've got to get rid of all these West Point generals. And the Postmaster General, Montgomery Blair of West Point, is sitting there, and he's got to defend his alma mater. Says, well, there's plenty of good West Point generals, you just got to find them. But why did he put up with these, whether they were from West Point or not? Why did he put up with especially the maddening, frustrating, impossible, pompous, paranoid, unreliable George McClellan? Well, Lincoln was asked this question over and over again, believe me, and he had a very simple answer. This is another one of those things that we forget when we look at him on his big white throne in Washington. Abraham Lincoln was elected with the smallest percentage of the popular vote of any president post 1828. He had fewer than 40% of the votes. So that means more than 60% didn't like him. They were Democrats, splintered among all these different factions. Well, McClellan was a Democrat. Lincoln was a Republican. Or as Lincoln put it, he's a majority general and I'm a minority president. And that's why he kept him. There was constant talk inside the army at the highest levels of Washington, in letters to McClellan, in personal visits to McClellan, about setting up a military dictatorship. I mean, we've got Lincoln's example of how a democratically elected government survives a civil war. They didn't have that. They had a history that said it's impossible. The Roman Republic turned to its Caesar. The French Republic turned to its Napoleon. What's needed in a crisis like this is a dictator. McClellan flirted with that idea. Sometimes I have half a mind of taking my large military family to Washington and settling a few matters there, he said in one letter. So when did Lincoln fire McClellan? Well, very interesting timing on that. In the fall of 1862, they had the off-year congressional elections, and as I say, Lincoln, although most Republicans thought it was a terrible debacle, Lincoln looked at the results and felt reasonably good about them. He lost one governorship. He lost 2 state legislatures. He's lost a lot of seats in the House of Representatives, but he still had a majority, very comfortable. And he actually gained seats in the Senate. He had gone to the American people, having raised taxes, having suffered defeats on the battlefield, having issued the Emancipation Proclamation, announced he was going to sign it, very controversial. All of these very difficult decisions that he had taken, and he still had control of the government. He was no longer a minority president. The American people had sent him back, left him in power, and 2 days later, McClellan was gone.
So let's go back to Lincoln, his childhood, how does he grow in his attitudes, that sort of thing. So the question is, can you tell us something about Lincoln's parents? Can you tell us something about how his geographic roots in Southern Illinois influenced his attitudes about social justice, particularly about slavery? And then to go back to that geography, there's an Illini here who confesses they never heard the idea that Illinois in any way had thought about seceding. Mm-hmm. You were talking about a broader Midwest thing.
Yes.
But could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, Illinois was a big part of that. They called Southern Illinois Little Dixie. If you check your map, I mean, it dips way down there. And the attitudes in Southern Illinois were very different from the attitudes in Chicago. Which were very different from the attitudes in Springfield. A couple of thoughts about that. Lincoln's parents, I think, are very important to his personality. People ask why, well, somebody's estimated there were 16,000 biographies of Lincoln written, and now 16,001. And why would you do that? Why so much attention to this man? And part of it is the drama of his times, but part of it is this strange quality of enormous charisma. I mean, he had it in life. He walks out of the forest, basically, into the small village of New Salem. He describes himself as a strange, friendless, penniless boy, but strange. He was wearing leather pantaloons that he had outgrown. They came down to his shin and were so tight that his feet were purple from the lack of circulation. This bizarre figure, 2 years later, is their state representative. Charisma. And it speaks to us down through the years. We're still drawn to him, and yet he also had this wall that came down and hid his interior that no one penetrated or has ever penetrated, though we keep trying 16,001 times. His friend, longtime associate Leonard Swett told one of the early biographers who was going around interviewing everyone who knew Lincoln, he said, I'll tell you this, if you want to know how to determine whether the person you're talking to was close to Lincoln, and the biographers, yeah, that would save me a lot of time. Anybody who says he was close to Lincoln was not close to Lincoln. Anybody who says he wasn't might have been. Nobody was close to Lincoln. Billy Herndon, his law partner, called him the loneliest man who ever lived. And that goes back to those parents. His father was cold, had no appreciation or understanding of the fact that he was parenting one of the world's great natural geniuses. He thought Lincoln was lazy. He thought reading books was a waste of time. His mother, beloved mother, died when he was 9 years old. And a little story that I'd never been able to get over. The biographers normally say that after his mother died, Thomas Lincoln went back to their town in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, and found an old friend, Sarah Bush Johnston, and they got married and came back because he needed somebody to raise his kids. Well, what happened is he left a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old in a hut in the middle of a howling wilderness. Lincoln talks about the panther screaming at night. He left those two kids alone there. There was a sort of addled 14-year-old cousin up the road a couple of miles. They were alone for over 3 months. Sarah Bush Johnston says when she got back, the 2 kids were like animals, half-starved, filthy, in rags. I mean, what would the experience of that abandonment do to a sensitive 9-year-old boy? He never let people close enough to hurt him. One of the heartbreaking things he says in his life to Joshua Speed, who may have been the nearest thing he had to a true friend, he said, "The trouble with friends, Speed, is that you lose them." So this loneliness that was part of his whole life, and that he turned as president into an asset. He was so good at turning his experiences into assets. We see this in his folksy colloquialisms that we love so much. All of this was stuff that he observed. For example, when he withstood the cabinet crisis of December 1862, managed to keep his cabinet balanced between the conservative Seward and the more liberal Salmon Chase. He kept both of them in the cabinet. How did he describe that? He says, "I have a pumpkin in each end of my bag, now I can ride." Clearly somebody who had tried to ride a horse with one pumpkin. But this isolated man was able to use people. I mean, he could like them, he could care about them, but he never let his affections get in the way of his cold, calculated decisions. So it was his friends, his associates from Springfield who did the most complaining about, oh, he never gives us jobs we want. He never sends contracts our way. Why doesn't he ever do anything for his friends? This Lincoln is a monster. He's so cold-hearted. We thought we knew him. How did Lincoln describe that same situation? I have more horses than I have oats. I know my friends will stay with me because they're my friends. It's my enemies that I need to stay with me. So those are some of the things that he learned. On the question of geography, I'll touch very shortly on this. I said there were no railroads, there were no paved roads, so how were they going to get into this vast country and break it apart? Rivers. Rivers were the great highways of transportation in North America in the mid-19th century. Macpherson has called the country a frontier of rivers. And no one understood this better than Lincoln, whose first job as a young man was ferrying some passengers from the shore to a steamboat in the middle of the Ohio River. And a year after that, he took a flatboat all the way down the Ohio, down the Mississippi to New Orleans, which is where he first witnessed the appalling condition of slavery firsthand. He did it again, another flatboat trip down that most important highway of the war, the Ohio-Mississippi River Network. So that geography experience was very important to his military strategy.
So on the personal side and the business about friends, this questioner says the movie Lincoln portrays the president's relationship with his son Robert as troubled. In later years, did Robert understand what his father had done? What happened to Robert?
What happened to Robert Kennedy? Lincoln, I'm sorry. We know what happened to Robert Kennedy, and that's a tragic story as well. The Lincoln family, it's as sad a story as you can come up with, and Catherine Clinton's wonderful biography of Mary Lincoln called Mrs. Lincoln is the best thing on this. Lincoln, in February of 1862, he had 4 sons. He had a wife who was tempestuous and brilliant and unstable, and many other corrections to that in Catherine's book, but I've got the microphone, so I'll describe her. They were drawn together by a passion for politics. She was a great political associate for him. Robert was their oldest, and he was the most Todd-like, they say. The Todds were aristocrats from Kentucky. He had the round Todd face, he had the Todd temperament. He was reserved, he was aloof, he was a little bit appalled probably by his coarse, unmannered father. He went off to prep school in New England, he went to Harvard, he became a very wealthy man. And they were never close. The portrayal, the slap in the movie is made up, but it accurately reflects the tension of that relationship. They lost their second son at the age of 3, Edward Baker Lincoln. So they moved into the White House with these 2 young sons, the first little kids in White House history. And they had the run of the place. They went charging into and out of cabinet meetings. They made these friends with the Taft brothers who lived around the corner. They had sleepovers. The house was ringing with laughter. Lincoln loved these boys, and most of all, his third son, Willie Wallace Lincoln, who was, as one friend said, Lincoln again. They were so much alike. Poetic temperament, a natural understanding of people, very methodical minds. Lincoln once watched Willie working out a problem, difficult problem, and he scrunched up his face and finally brightened with understanding. Lincoln turned to his seatmate and said, "I know every step by which that boy solved his problem because it's exactly that same way that my mind works." Lincoln loved that boy more than anything else in the world, another friend said. And in February of 1862, while all the rest of this is going on, Willie got sick with typhoid fever and died. Mary had a breakdown. She didn't leave her room for weeks. The Taft boys were banished from the house. Tad was now left without a friend in the world, if you can imagine. And Lincoln had to become the strength of his family as well as everything else. Robert was the only one that survived into adulthood, and I don't think he ever did really come to grips. And he didn't have much to work with either. He said at one point, "I did not talk to my father more than 10 minutes in a stretch during his entire presidency." Lincoln was just that busy. And so I've covered politicians for 30 years, men and women running for president, and the question I ask myself, and more as I have become a parent, is why do people do that to their kids? And this is as good an example as we've had in our history of the toll that the presidency takes on families.
Ladies and gentlemen, David Von Drehle.